Sarah.
For everything you've done to me.
Sarah.
For everything you've done to me.
Sarah.
You.
Sarah.
You.
Sarah.
Stupid.
Sarah.
That's my name. Don't wear it up.
Sarah. I can't breathe, babe. Seriously.
Yeah, that's when you do when you choke me.
Sarah. 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 Sarah, I can't breathe, babe.
That's on you.
Sarah, I can't breathe.
It's on you.
Sarah.
Real ransom. Might want to get video for it extra. Because I got this.
Sarah.
Real ransom.
Sarah. Sarah, I can't breathe, babe.
Oh. That's what I feel like when you chewing on me.
Sarah. Please, Sarah.
Yeah. You should probably shut up.
Sarah.
Shh.
Sarah.
As you will have seen from the footage that played before I've come into this video, we are going to deep dive the case of Sarah Boone. Now, I have done this on my community channel, I have done this on my Patreon, because this is one of those cases that I have been a little bit on the obsessed side with, and for good reason. I have been following this literally since 2020 because it is a case of so many twists and turns, and actually you may be surprised with my belief about the sentencing at the end of this video, and I would be so interested to know what you think about the sentencing, and also what you think about Sarah Boone, who she is, how she comes across, and of course how you feel about what happened to Jorge Torres. And at the end of the day, this is going to be one of those cases that involves a lot of loops, a lot of twists, a lot of turns, because Sarah Boone is what we consider a complex case and a complex individual. Also, for those of you new to my channel, I release my crime deep dives here twice weekly on my main channel. It will always be this way. If you do want more, you can see a lot of my extra content, full-length videos on Patreon and YouTube membership. To each of you who support me there, you know I can't do this without you, so a major shout out and thank you. If you have come back to my channel again and you like what you're seeing and you haven't subscribed, please do. Helps me massively. Get your notifications on. You'll never miss an episode. And also make sure that you give me a like, because that's really helpful. And I know some of you are doing that now, and it is just making a big difference. And on a selfish level, I never ever want to stop making content here. And those kind of little extras help me massively when it comes down to putting out content and being able to create more. Let's talk about the one, the only Sarah Boone. She was born in 1978. She was born in Florida. And of course, she has gained mass notoriety, and I mean international notoriety, for the alleged murder of her boyfriend, Jorge Torres Jr. Now, what can we say about them without a shadow of a doubt before I go into this case? They had a tumultuous relationship. I've worked really hard on trying to bring a balanced approach regarding who Boone is and also who Torres is to this video. And the reason for that is it's very easy to skirt over some of the more complex issues when a murder takes place or a death takes place, because you want to always come down on the side of the victim. And of course, We absolutely want to have the victim at heart in this case. But I also don't want to detract from the more murky, challenging details about how this is played out. And I will say from the get-go, I have absolutely no sympathy and no empathy for Sarah Boone. I think you all know me by now, and you know that that goes without saying. But there are certain things that I also think we need to explore. It's just not as simple as saying she is a hideous murderer and we should completely disbelieve her version of events. I think nuance is so important. So, what can we say about how this starts to play out? At first glance, essentially, the case of Sarah Boone and Jorge Torres, it seems like a tragic accident. So essentially, if the investigators hadn't done a really effective job on this case and just taken Sarah Boone at her word, it could have been dismissed as this bizarre hide and seek game that went wrong. Yes, we are going to pick that apart very shortly, but as the case starts to unfold, what we actually find out is this whole chilling reality where cruelty, dysfunction, and to be fair, a relationship that's marred by volatility is the actual culprit behind George's death. Now, it goes without saying that Jorge Torres died in a horrible way, and we have every sympathy and empathy for him and also for his wider family who've been affected by this case. But there is a lot to go through. So let's talk about the infamous, the internationally known now, Sarah Boone. So she was born on the 10th of October, 1977. She was born to John and Karen Louise Paulson. There isn't a lot that's known about her family background with respect, and believe me, I did dig deep. However, what we do know is she's originally from Florida. She also lived in or around the Winter Park area near Orlando. She was married once previously. She had a son from that marriage. In fact, her ex-husband, Brian Boone, he was the first person that she called after discovering that Torres is dead. And he actually said to her, listen, you need to call the police immediately. Because at the end of the day, you should not be calling me first if you found your boyfriend passed away. You need to be getting the emergency services. You need to be at least attending to some kind of life-saving care, even if it fails, as opposed to calling me. The very fact that he is the person that she thinks about when faced with this horror, the immediate person that comes to mind, that demonstrates that Brian Boone must have been somebody who was relatively organised, somebody that she could rely on for a period of time, and probably somebody who brought her function in a very dysfunctional world that she lived within. Now, Sarah, she had met Brian Boone in the late 1990s, and they dated until their marriage in 2005. They had one son, Lucas. He's now 14 years old. And that marriage, it lasted around 11 years until 2016. At this point, Brian begins divorce proceedings. And I am pretty convinced that many of us by the end of this video will have empathy and sympathy with Brian as to why he decided that maybe staying with Sarah Boone was not the best thing for his mental health and well-being. Now, they were officially divorced in 2017. People said that when she was with Brian Boone, there was a level of stability. So before their divorce, essentially her life had a rhythm. But one of the things that has come out is that she had actually been abusive in their relationship. Brian said, you know what? She used to hit me a lot. She used to drink a lot, and that would really exacerbate that kind of behaviour. And that's completely disgraceful, and it gives us a historical understanding of the way that Sarah Boone is in relationships. Now, they did end up sharing joint custody of their son. This is right up until February 2020. Apparently, though, because of her dysfunction in her life, the fact that she drank, the fact that she was in, shall we say, problematic relationships, she didn't have the reliability that I would say is required to be present to your child. So she's very unreliable when she's looking after him. She absolutely struggled with alcohol dependency, and this apparently was something that marred her life. And it's also a factor that frequently was cited in her disputes with Jorge Torres. So he's a drinker as well, and obviously that is going to exacerbate any fractures in the foundations of the relationship. Also, those kind of issues really did cause problems with her relationship with her son, and also with Brian, her ex-husband. Now, interestingly, Brian's lawyer was actually looking into changing access arrangements because they believed that Sarah Boone was so unreliable that she wasn't a good influence on her son. So this was going on before George's death. Brian also said that she was more reliable as a mother when Jorge Torres was serving time in jail. In fact, there was an interview that Brian engaged in, and he said, listen, she could be relied on when Jorge Torres was out of the picture. But we're not going to afford her any sympathy or empathy there because she's making an active choice. Your behaviour is based in choice, and she's putting her relationship with Jorge Torres ahead of her relationship with her child. And I'm so glad that her son has got a very reliable party involved in his life in the form of his father. Now, what was Sarah Boone supposedly like when she wasn't in prison? Well, first of all, the neighbours who knew her, they said she was somebody who was quite friendly. Her friends who knew her said she was somebody who was relatively nice to be around. She could be really warm. She could be incredibly personable. And even though as a communicator, some of the things that she communicates really does send you to a different dimension of understanding, what those around her noted is she is relatively eloquent. She can hold a conversation and she can seem interested in their lives. But they all agreed the minute that she was drinking, it would lead to mood swings. And apparently she would drink to the point where at times she'd walk into the wrong apartment. Now, it does happen. I've watched TikTok videos that my son has shown me where people have literally woken up on people's couches thinking it was their friend's house or their house, and it turns out it's just a stranger's house or a neighbour's house. Not ideal, does happen occasionally when you're very inebriated. But as opposed to walking in drunk into a home that you think is yours and then thinking, oh, this is very different. For example, none of my furniture is here and it's a completely different decor. And oh, who's that individual sat on the couch there? No, she didn't respond that way. There was no, I'm really sorry. I've wandered into the wrong apartment. How can I apologise? How can I make this up for you? No, she just had a massive go at the people who were inside as opposed to actually apologising. Now, understandably, over time, that kind of behaviour means that people don't want to associate with her. Her work life was really erratic too. She occasionally took administrative or retail jobs, but she did have quite a lot of financial difficulties. And during COVID, that worsened substantially. Obviously, those disruptions played out for many people in that way. And certainly Sarah Boone was a victim of those financial issues. Now let's talk about the relationship with Jorge Torres. So she ends up starting to date him just after her divorce is going through around 2017, 2018. And everybody who knew her said, listen, this is a line in the sand. Her life begins to fall apart. Firstly, because of the end of her marriage, because like I said, that offered her a level of stability, a level of habit, because she's going through the motions of being a mother and a wife. And as I've said, she still had joint custody of her son at this time, but that's why it's notable that things start to change. She becomes really unreliable. Her relationship with Jorge Torres seems to exacerbate all unreliability, and we're not blaming him for that. But what we're saying is it highlights a change in her behaviour when she meets him. And Jorge Torres essentially was somebody who perfectly mirrored who she was. So he was also erratic. He was also explosive. He was also a drinker. He's described by people who knew him as passionate yet volatile. And with respect, that's not a great mix. I mean, it's great to be around people who are passionate. It's really not great being around people who are volatile. And they're very different feelings and experiences and actions. When you're passionate, you might debate people with a real intensity. When you're passionate, you might get excited about certain things that you're interested in. But volatility is essentially based in aggression. When you're volatile, it means you're highly aggressive and defensive, which can be deep problems in any relationship. So both Sarah Boone and Jorge Torres are known for these really intense arguments. Often the arguments are centered around finances, around jealousy, and around accusations of infidelity. So this is a really toxic relationship from the get-go. Her drinking also exacerbated the problems. It led to even more of an unpredictable mood. She exacerbated the challenges in this, what can we say, already deeply strained and toxic relationship. And they had that classic unhealthy on-off pattern of breaking up and reconciling. And all the friends knew that they never quite understood whether the couple would be together or whether they'd have broken up. Now, to outsiders, you could say their love was a really cautionary tale of two people who ended up locked in this destructive bond and who couldn't walk away, yet they were totally incapable of coexisting peacefully. So let's just take a minute to talk about Jorge Torres, the victim in this case. He was born on the 13th of February 1978. He was born in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. He died at the age, very sadly, of 42, which is incredibly young. He was only 103 pounds at the time of his death. So that's 7 stone 3 pounds or 47 kilograms. So he's a very slight man physically. Now, he was born to Jorge Torres Sr. and Blanca Torres, and he had 9 siblings. So he comes from a very big family. His sister, Victoria Torres, she actually became a really key representative for the family when he had died. And she described him, and actually the wider family described him, as kind-hearted but troubled, and he was. And she also noted that he had a history of alcohol abuse. Also, he had had prior relationships before meeting Sarah Boone, so he had children from previous relationships. Anna Victoria, Jorge Torres III, and Destiny Mia. Now, work-wise, he sporadically worked. He took on manual labour. He was a handyman. And friends said, you know, the thing about Jorge Torres was when he was sober, he was really laid back. He was a decent human being. But similar to Sarah Boone, he's combative when he drinks alcohol. How often do we see this play out? How often do we see people that we truly like and respect and like to spend time around just totally change and transition when they drink alcohol? And whilst that is still who they are and their actions are totally accountable and responsible to them, I do believe that people are often unaware of just how unpalatable they are when they drink alcohol. Genuinely, I do not believe that for the most part they're going out of their way to become horrible people. Everybody reacts and responds differently to alcohol and the toxicity it creates for our bodies. We all know those lucky people who sit there quaffing a few bottles of wine, having a few shots, finishing it off with a Courvoisier at the end of the night. They're up at 6 o'clock jogging. They've never had a hangover in their life. I literally cannot understand how they exist. We also know people who are just the nicest, funniest, sweetest people under the alcoholic influence. We also know people who fall asleep or cry. And of course, we know those who get angry. The interplay of alcohol in your brain and body is different depending on who you are. It's different independent of your DNA, for example. So these are really important realities to accept. So who they are drunk is not necessarily the fair representation of who they are when they are sober. But obviously, as human adults, they have a need to understand who they are drunk and to temper that because they are not nice people. Neither Sarah Boone nor Jorge Torres are people you want to be around when they are drunk. Now, when they get together, they bond over similar humour. Also, they've got a penchant for social drinking, shall we say. And really what we're talking about there is binge drinking. Friends and neighbours said that one of the things that was really typical about their relationship was 1 minute, they'd just be laughing loudly, they'd be having fun. The next minute, they would just be arguing very, very bitterly. Now, as their relationship progresses, they end up moving into a rental property in the Winter Park area. It's approximately 20 minutes drive from downtown Orlando. By 2019, what can we say? Tensions in the relationship are brewing, very obvious to people around them. Neighbours start to overhear very loud fights. Actually, there are documented incidents where the police are called out. And I appreciate people can have a bad day, the police can get called, but for the most part, I imagine very few of you have ever been through that situation because for the most part, we temper our behaviour according to our environment and we are aware of our surroundings. So you don't want to be getting your neighbours upset with you because you are being absolutely aggressive and unholy in the way that you are treating your partner. And so for the most part, even one call out by the police tends not to have happened in our lives. Now, when they come out to these scenes where they're arguing, it turns out that both Jorge Torres and Sarah Boone end up having bruises or injuries at the time. Now, Sarah Boone would say, listen, Jorge Torres has actually aggressed me. And he would say, no, she is the one who's responsible for hurting me. And people who knew Sarah Boone said she was somebody who was really manipulative. She was somebody who was physically aggressive, especially when she drank. And we can already acknowledge and testify to the fact that her first husband says she physically abused him. So she's very handy with her hands, shall we say. And this cycle of these disturbances where neighbours call the police, these are repeated domestic disturbances. This is a pattern of very unhealthy behaviour. He had actually been arrested 4 times for domestic violence against her. And what she would do is she would get him arrested and then she would post bail for him. Now, she claims that there was a long history of domestic and alcohol abuse, and I would imagine it was 6 of one, half a dozen of the other. I am not going to pretend that Jorge Torres is some innocent bystander in this situation. We've been told by family members that when he drinks alcohol, he's volatile. We've been told that certainly he has a personality that can shift and change dependent on his mental state affected by alcohol, for example. And he was on parole at the time of his death. Now, a former neighbour who knew Sarah Boone said she did see marks on Boone's arms and her neck, and she said that Sarah Boone also readily discussed the abuse. Now, let's be clear, she was also arrested for violence against him once. So they have this horrible, incredibly high and incredibly low relationship pattern. They're either the best of friends or the worst of enemies, and both are guilty of highly inappropriate behaviour around one another. I think we can definitely say, however, that Sarah Boone is the manipulator in this relationship. She's brighter than Jorge Torres, and she uses that to her advantage. Now, despite what I've just described, which would ideally have each partner running in the opposite direction, screaming, "Please save me from this toxicity," that's not how it works. We're talking about the classic bad love scenario. They love the way it makes them feel when it's working out. They hate the way it makes them feel when it's falling apart. They just have that addictive cycle to each other. So despite all the turmoil I've just talked about, they apparently seemed inseparable. Sarah claimed, "I love him, but he's driving me crazy." That was actually according to a friend's statement. Jorge Torres' friend said that apparently he wanted to leave Sarah, but that he also confirmed the two seemed locked in this cycle of separation and reunion. Now, as I've said, things start to really slide when COVID hits. And so many of us can look back at that COVID craziness and recognise that a lot of us went through COVID era strains, essentially. There was a whole stress around that experience. People fell out with each other. People became financially in a really bad situation. Whole families were prevented from seeing one another, and mental health just spiraled. All these things played out during that weird period. Now, the lockdown period in early to mid 2020 in particular, that caused lots of stresses and strains in Jorge Torres and Sarah Boone's home because, of course, they're often confined together at home, and this just magnifies and intensifies those conflicts. Sarah Boone's finances become a real problem. They grow really precarious. Jorge Torres has got unstable employment. So now, aside from the general arguments that they tend to have anyway, they're starting to argue about money. So their arguments about money are now overlapping with the arguments about trust, about the arguments about substance abuse. That amplifies the stress, that amplifies the violence, because we know that stress absolutely is an exacerbator of all of those negative traits. Now, the prelude to the tragedy that plays out begins on the 23rd of February 2020. They are both drinking together. They've started in the afternoon, and we all know that daytime drinking is often a recipe for disaster. Now, according to Sarah's eventual statement to the police, she and Jorge Torres spent the day at home drinking quite a lot. She actually referred to wine for herself. She also referred to possibly beer or whiskey for him. She also later claimed that they were in really good spirits. They were listening to music. They were doing creative activities like painting. But as it moves into the evening, one of the things that's absolutely noted by neighbours is that they can hear heated voices. It's not constant, they're not constantly shouting at each other, but there are intermittent times between 7 p.m. and 9 p.m. Nobody actually called law enforcement that particular night, which is a real shame because I wouldn't be talking about this had that happened. Now, when Sarah Boone was questioned about what the neighbours have heard, she basically pushed it away and brushed it off and said, "You know what? We are people as a couple who had really small spats, but then we'd make up really quickly. It was just there'd be a moment of jealousy or a moment of paranoia, particularly if one of them thought that the other was cheating." Sarah claimed that by nightfall that day, she and Jorge Torres were doing really well together. They were getting along fine. And she later said to the detectives, "We were playing hide and seek as if we were kids again." Now, I don't know whether they lived in a castle. I mean, I do because I've seen where they lived. Now, the point is, in my home, you may get away with playing hide and seek. You know, I've got 3 stories and quite a lot of storage space. So at the end of the day, you know, I can shoehorn myself into some strange positions. So you could get away with playing hide and seek for a short period of time if you were going against kids. Because, you know, kids can't figure out just how crazy adults are and how we can, contortion-wise, get ourselves into situations when we want to win a game. We're highly competitive. We all know it. All of us adults, when we're playing with kids, something like hide and seek, yeah, we're going to give in the end. But for the most part, we like to make it clear that we're pretty effective hiders. But their place really doesn't seem as if there would be many places to actually hide, and it wouldn't take you very long to seek. But allegedly, that's what they're doing, you know, getting behind the shower curtain and hiding behind the couch and taking less than 6 seconds clearly to actually go, oh, I found you. You're just right here because we haven't really got a lot of room in this house, but never mind. So that's a kind of weird story anyway, isn't it? It's a kind of strange story to peddle to the authorities, but nonetheless, this is what she says. And then she says that she thought it would be funny for Jorge Torres to hide in a large blue suitcase. Now again, I don't want to crumble her suggestion of how this played out, but isn't the actual main emphasis, the main motive of the game, hide and seek, to go and hide so that somebody can seek you? I've never been in a situation where the person who has to count to 20 basically says, oh, what you need to do, you just need to go behind that cupboard there and you just hide there. Or, you know what you want to do? You want to just go in the garage and position yourself behind all those boxes and then I'll come and find you. But obviously I'll pretend that I didn't know that you were there. Because that goes against what hide and seek is. But apparently they're deciding that it'd be really funny if Jorge Torres gets in this large blue suitcase. Now, apparently that suitcase measured approximately 30 inches tall. But apparently that's what happened. He actually got into a suitcase and was essentially zipped up. Now again, I have been in situations, and I'm sure a lot of you out there have been in situations, where certain small objects have seemed very appetizing to try to fit into. I guarantee that many people who are listening to this now will themselves have tried to get themselves in things like suitcases. My own children ruined one of my suitcases with wheels by getting themselves in and zipping it up and unsurprisingly buckling the entire thing. And it was a new suitcase as well. So this is not unusual. I get it. You're having a bit of a laugh. You've had a bit of a drink. Your person gets in and says, this is really funny, zip me up. However, there is clearly a necessity to get the person out, isn't there? And if somebody's just got into a suitcase, particularly a small suitcase, you're going to want to know that they're safe. But of course, if that game had ended how it would end for you or I, having a bit of fun with our family, our friends, our partner, I wouldn't be telling this story. Because unfortunately, on February the 23rd, 2020, sometime during that night, Sarah Boone calls her ex-husband, Brian Boone, waking him up, saying that she's got herself into a situation. She's really drunk. Bear in mind, her husband's tired. He's divorcing her. He really doesn't need to deal with her anymore. He's got work the next day and he's experienced calls like this before, so he just hangs up. Then the following morning, this is February the 24th, he realises maybe I should call her, check in on her, see what was happening. He tries calling Sarah Boone. It's also Sarah Boone's turn to have a son. Bear in mind, she's often unreliable, so Brian thinks at this point she's probably not going to turn up. He does get through to her. This is around 12:30 p.m. on the 24th. So, you know, we're going on a whole day after that in the afternoon where they started drinking. At this point, she says to Brian, Jorge Torres is dead, and she asked him to come over. She says, look, we were playing hide and seek, and I fell asleep. Brian says, call the police. And then, like the good man he is, he actually drives over. Now, en route to hers, she calls again to check he's coming. He says, have you rang 911? She has to remind him. The ex-husband then arrives around 10 minutes later. At this point, Sarah Boone tells him that George is dead. Brian said that when he looked at her, he knew that she was actually being serious because she was shaking, she was freaking out. And guess what? She still hadn't called 911. Who in any way, shape or form, drunk or otherwise, would not immediately reach for the phone, call 911 and try to get some help, even if it's too late just for your own conscience. The very fact that she holds off speaks of guilt. It speaks of responsibility to some degree. I'm not saying that she's thinking to herself, I have killed this man. I am thinking she is believing I have contributed towards this death, and that's why she hasn't gone ahead and called the police and the ambulance service. And bear in mind, Jorge Torres is meant to be this guy that she's crazy about. Yeah, they have problems. Yeah, they're up and down. But absolutely, she really loves him, apparently. So why would you not, in that moment, do everything you could possibly do to ensure that you've done the best you can for them? The very fact that she doesn't speaks of such egocentricity. It speaks of somebody so self-motivated, so self-concerned, so self-interested that she is not thinking about anybody but herself. Now, the ex, Brian, says you need to call the police because he knows it's true. He can actually see George's dead body. At this point, he goes back outside, and rightfully so, because you don't want to be at the scene of a potential crime. And bear in mind, Sarah Boone's got an MO for violence. Brian Boone has been at the receiving hand of the violence. So he's probably thinking to himself, this is really strange. There is a guy's dead body in that room. I don't want to be contaminating anything. I don't want to be involved in this. I don't want to be implicated in this. Bearing in mind, he had already arrived at the scene of the death before the authorities did, which could seem really suspicious. So he gets back into his own car and he just waits until the police arrive. Later, he said in court, I was there, I knew I'd have to talk to somebody about it. So he's basically said I didn't drive off. I knew that I'd have to be present when the police arrived. So again, what does that tell us about Brian Boone? Probably that he had a long suffering experience of being married to Sarah Boone. And even now, even though he isn't responsible for her, he has a level of compassion towards the situation and also a definite understanding of what responsibility is. That's why he hangs out for the police. He also claimed he wasn't surprised at what she actually had done. And Sarah, during this period, is just having a cigarette and a drink. So again, she's thinking about her own needs, not anybody else's. He also said he felt it was inevitable. He said she was violent towards me on numerous occasions, and this is just more of the same, just with an absolutely fatal outcome. So because Brian Boone has come along and said, listen, you need to call the police, and because he's now nearby to her, she finally makes that 911 call. That happens at 11:49 a.m. It's really strange the way that she handles it, because she calmly, to some degree, for the situation at play at least, she certainly isn't hysterical, she relatively calmly informs them that my boyfriend is dead.
911, what is the location of your emergency? 4748 France Court, apartment 3.
4748, what's the street name?
France, F-R-A-N-T-D.
And the apartment number?
3.
Is this a police or medical?
My boyfriend is dead.
Fire risk, that's the location, Mercy.
That's 32.
No, please don't leave.
4748 France Lane, apartment 3.
France Court.
France Court.
Yes.
Okay, is this near Mackenzie Drive?
I don't know where that is.
Okay, fine, okay.
It's Hillwood Park Apartments.
Okay, 4748 France, correct?
Correct.
All right, great. Now tell me exactly what happened there.
My boyfriend and I were playing last night, and I put him in a case and we were playing. And
Okay.
like kind of hide and seek kind of thing. So I fell asleep and I woke up and he was dead in the suitcase. So I don't know what happened.
She says, when they're asking questions, oh, he's dead, he's stiff and purple. She says that she woke up, she couldn't find George, and then she remembers that he could still be in the suitcase. Now, as the call progresses, you can hear that she starts to panic because it's all getting a little bit real now. She says, he's not moving, he's purple, I'm calling you now. She claims that she's attempted CPR. At this point, she's told to do it again. Now, understandably, this is an unusual death. It's been said that a guy's been in a suitcase and has now died and lost his life, so law enforcement arrived quickly. They are so pleasant I'm going to be honest with you, in that situation, I would be thinking there is something altogether suspicious playing out, but that's actually really quite sweet to her. And even though she is already hard work, I would say they manage her really effectively. So Orange County Sheriff's deputies and paramedics end up reaching the scene relatively quickly. They then arrive, go into the home, and they find George's body next to the large blue suitcase. It's very clear he's dead. He's unresponsive and he's stiff, and it's obvious to them there is no hope for him. At this point, he's officially declared dead. Now, at the scene, Boone is just desperately trying to explain what happened, and she doesn't seem concerned about him. She just seems very concerned about herself. She's immediately doing that classic, trying to frame his death as this tragic accident. And she's described at that point by the officers who attended as appearing visibly shaken. But I would say it's very temporary because her demeanour changes very, very quickly. And like I said, she's very much concerned about her own needs.
I had a bottle of wine and then decided to play hide and seek. So
What time was that? Do you remember?
I mean, I know that I was in bed probably by 12:30.
Okay.
Well, I went upstairs at least, and I fell asleep,
Okay.
forgetting that he was
So
in
you
the
guys were
suitcase.
playing the hide and go seek.
Yes.
And at some point you put him in the suitcase?
No, he got in the suitcase. So he thought it would be funny to be put in the suitcase. So I was like, okay, well, I'm going to joke with you, and I'll zip you up and make him, squirm a little bit, whatever it is. But then I fell asleep. I fell asleep.
Where was the suitcase?
Right
You
where
got
it
in
is.
Right down there?
Yes.
You zipped him in there?
Yes.
Thought he would be funny, a little
It
joke.
was. We both were laughing about it.
Okay.
And then I fell asleep
Where did you fall asleep at?
upstairs.
In your bedroom?
Yes.
Okay.
Totally forgetting that he was in the suitcase still.
Okay. And then you came back downstairs?
This morning, or this
around
afternoon, yes, when I got
about
up.
What time?
12:30-ish. I was awake, but I totally forgot that he was in the suitcase.
Now, when they do their initial observations, investigators can see that there are small bruises and cuts on George's arm, also on his shoulders, possibly on his head. And that's consistent with potentially trying to force his way out of the actual suitcase. Or also it could be that he'd suffered some external blows. The suitcase handle was also slightly bent, and the zipper's interior mechanism was damaged because he'd frantically been pushing. So he's essentially locked in what would become this very small coffin. Now, of course, as Sarah is explaining, she's just insisting that those first statements that she made were absolutely true, that she thought he was in there, she thought he was safe, she thought there was no problem, she didn't intend for him to die. She said that she didn't even hear George's cries because apparently she went upstairs, she was tired, she fell asleep, she forgot. And she said, listen, I went to bed absolutely certain he could get out of the case unaided. I didn't think there was a problem. She also claimed any reference to cheating or choking were part of the couple's twisted sense of humour because they're always arguing with each other. She said that, we weren't in a situation building up to that moment where he gets in the case where there was any conflict. She said, we had a few spats that evening as the neighbours had reported, but it was no big deal. She told the detective, look, I looked over. I saw him settling himself to the suitcase. I zipped him up. Sarah then said to the detectives, look, he climbed in, I zipped it up for fun. She said, we're laughing. We thought that we were having a great time. I thought he could free himself. We thought it was funny that he was small enough to fit inside. She then said, I went upstairs and I basically forgot. I fell asleep. And then, of course, I wake up. I think, where is George? And then I think to myself, oh my God, could he still be in the suitcase? And that's when she goes down and apparently unzips him and finds that he is indeed dead. So at this point, with the story that she's telling, with the intricacy of the lies that she's weaving, it appears to be a really genuinely tragic accident. And of course, it is one that she could have avoided if she'd stayed awake. But nonetheless, at this point, it was considered clearly unintentional. But this is where it all becomes just a little bit more complicated, because during the conversations with detectives, as is the case in many investigations, they say, can we analyse your phone? because we just want to check whether what you're saying to us is adding up. We all know, don't we, that people can be in these situations and essentially pretend that their relationship with their partner is amazing and there's no problems and everything was just hunky-dory. And then, of course, they get the phone and they analyse the phone and it turns out that that person's been plotting to kill them. This happens time and time again. And the fact is, you are asked whether you are willing to do that. They can, of course, get a warrant to do that. But initially, you tend to be asked, are you willing to hand it over? And she is. So that does give us an insight into a lack of awareness on Sarah Boone's part as to what might be turned up with that phone evidence. Because if you're just happily handing it over and you're denying any involvement in somebody's death, aside from tragically being engaged in the actual accident itself that you were unaware was going to play out in this way, you don't have anything to hide. Of course, you're going to give your phone over. But what if drunk you and sober you have very different actions? And what if sober you isn't too good at memorizing what might have happened when drunk you was in charge? Because when they look on Sarah Boone's phone, they find some really critical video clips. So they've carried out this routine procedure. She's agreed to go ahead and hand it to them, and they have a quick look. The very fact, as I said, that she was willing to do so shows that she likely believes she had nothing to hide. But boy, was she so incorrect that it actually speaks to what we're saying about her mindset when she's drunk. She, Sarah Boone, who is sober, is completely distinct from she who is known when she's drunk. Because they just discovered the most hugely incriminating evidence. And of course, that evidence just demonstrates a totally different scene to the one that Sarah's described. And I'll be honest with you, the footage is harrowing. Harrowing beyond belief. Because the audio of that particular incident reveals Jorge Torres' muffled screams. He's saying, "I can't breathe. Seriously." And then he keeps repeating Sarah's name. He's desperate. Now, Sarah's voice responds just with mocking statements about choking, about cheating, and she's laughing and she's so slurry. You can hear the slur in her voice. She's deeply resentful in that communication and she's totally disregarding his panic. In fact, the footage shows that Sarah's voice is full of contempt. She says, "Yeah, that's what you do when you choke me. Oh, that's what it feels like when you cheat on me." And that laughter as well is just really sinister. Now, of course, Sarah is going to try to frame this in a completely different way. She's like, "No, this was just teasing. This was just taunting. I didn't think that George was actually in distress." Now, we can look at this and analyse this two ways. We can take it verbatim. Because to some degree, bear in mind, she's handed her phone over. She's completely unaware of what she was like in that moment. So the malevolence and desire to harm him is not something that's core memory in her mind. She likely didn't want to kill him. I have to say that at this point. She likely didn't want him to come to great harm. Yes, she wanted to teach him a lesson, but she doesn't believe that that's going to be a tragic lesson for him and indeed for her. Or we can say, no, she's just nasty to the core. She's somebody who has that malevolence running through her. And actually, she fully knew that he was in distress and she enjoyed it. She had that sadistic quality about her nature where she was enjoying the fact that she had the power and he had no control at all. Either of those are possibilities. Now, bear in mind, the suitcase itself was turned to the zipper face downward. That means that it was really difficult for George to actually open it because, of course, he's not got the potential to maneuver. He's in a really small space. He's also impaired by alcohol, so unzipping himself is even more complex. And let's all be clear, alcohol is a depressant. It's a depressant on our respiratory system. That's why people die at times when they're intoxicated. That's why they find themselves seriously unwell in hospital because of alcohol use. So this is a real cooking pot of possibility in every negative way that could occur because of this situation playing out that I'm talking about right now. And add to that all that is a possibility, even if you're just having fun when you're drunk. But Sarah Boone then goes to bed when he's desperately asking to be let out. So she says to the police, well, I went to bed around 12:30 to 1 a.m. I passed out, and the reason for that was I'd been drinking even more alcohol, and I just thought that George would be able to escape the suitcase on his own. Now, the forensic pathologist who later came into this to testify said that the compression and the lack of fresh air likely caused George to suffocate in the early hours of the 24th of February 2020. And again, when we talk about these cases, it's really easy to skirt over those moments where we're talking about the way that somebody died. And I understand that we don't want to focus too much on it, but I do want to just take a second to imagine the fear and terror in that man's experience. I can't even imagine that slow suffocation, the knowing that something terrible is happening, the having no control over how to manage that situation, literally feeling like you are trapped in this coffin that you have no way of escaping, and feeling more and more lightheaded and feeling more and more desperate. That is an arduous, torturous death, and that man went through it. And he could have been saved very easily. All it would have taken was for Sarah Boone to unzip the actual suitcase. Now, bear in mind, even though she's absolutely impressing on the detectives that she is innocent, she would never hurt him. It was a tragic accident. It was just a really weird game of hide and seek where all the rules changed and you actually knew as the seeker where the hider was, and it all makes sense. And they just wanted to play arts and crafts, and they were just really enjoying each other's company. It just blows to smithereens that actual narrative. It blows the innocent hide and seek explanation to pieces. The investigators say, listen, this is not a mere prank. This was a malicious act, or at least it was a grossly reckless one. And actually, I think that was very appropriate for them to note. And I think that was probably very fair of them as well. At this point, they're saying, listen, we know that what happened was because you chose to abandon your care for this man. You put him at serious risk. He may have been playing the game with you initially, but it became very dark, very dangerous, very problematic, and he was begging you to get him out. You chose to walk away. So it might have been a prank initially, but then you maliciously acted in a way that has led and contributed to his death. And even if we're going to think very well of you in this moment, maybe we're just saying you were grossly reckless, but you still contributed to his death. And she just is not willing to hear this. And I think that for the most part, that demonstrates the issues within Sarah Boone's personality. And she certainly has a personality disorder as far as I'm concerned. It goes without a shadow of a doubt that that is the case. Her extreme reactions, her self-interest, her selfish behaviour certainly plays into certain personality disorders. And I would say also the way that she is responding certainly suggests that she is dealing with some type of personality disorder. She can't accept any responsibility. She refuses. She just sees herself as this innocent victim in this tragic scenario that's played out. And now everyone's pointing the finger at her and she doesn't deserve it. Now, in later questioning, one of the things that Sarah actually says is she actually forgot she was recording. All the time she kind of changes her story. She says, well, actually, I do remember recording, but I filmed it because I wanted to show him how he acted. Which doesn't work because, of course, if she's doing this to teach him a lesson, well, the lesson should have ended, and it didn't end. He died. She also kept saying to the officers that she lived in fear and that she wanted to use her experience of her partner dying in a small suitcase in the most harrowing and torturous circumstances as a lesson about abuse. The abuse that he actually projected to her. So not, I'm going to talk about how my abuse of my partner led to his death. No. Sarah Boone's like, you know what? I'm probably going to take this and I'm probably going to use it as a Dr. Phil learning experience. I now know that I was an abused woman, and being this abused woman who obviously is in a scenario of powerlessness and helplessness, I then got my partner to climb into a small suitcase. I then videoed him, taunted him, tortured him, and he died. So the lesson there is that I'm the victim. Genuinely, I kid you not. She also told the police officers that he used to tell her that he'd make her unrecognisable. And if that was the case, that's absolutely abhorrent. But he didn't do that. He didn't make her unrecognisable. And we can only go off her evidence. And what we know of her evidence is she's a massive liar. Now, she was also questioned about some of the injuries on his body, because it's not just the fact that he suffocated in this case. There are injuries on his body, which looked like he was either trying to get himself out or maybe he'd been attacked. And she said, well, at one point I did use a bat, I kid you not, a bat to poke his hand back, saying it was basically a split-second decision to stop her being attacked by him. Can we be real about this? Listen, if a guy is going to domestically abuse you, if he's going to physically violate you, it doesn't matter whether you've got a bat in your hand. In fact, we've seen many times it play out where a woman's got a gun in her hand and it still doesn't save her because, you know, people don't necessarily have what it takes to kill someone even when they're defending themselves. They're good human beings who want to protect themselves, but it's too much to actually pull the trigger. And terrible things happened to them, even when they had a loaded gun in their hands. But with respect, if there's a bat in her hand, she's a female. Yes, she's much bigger than him, and I'm sure she can do some damage with it. But equally, if he has been abusive before, that's not going to stop him poking his hand back with a bat. She'll just have it taken off her and he'll use it against her. And that doesn't happen. Now, of course, the police are waiting for the autopsy findings, and it isn't hard for the medical examiner to determine positional asphyxia. I think we've all come to terms with the fact that that would be the correct one without even having to do an actual autopsy, because we know the inadequate breathing caused by being confined in the suitcase, especially once it was turned upside down, would likely be fatal. Now, the post-mortem report also talked about Jorge Torres' scratches on his back, on his neck. He actually had contusions to his shoulder, his skull, and his forehead from blunt force trauma. He also had a busted lip. So he isn't the one who's being abusive in this situation. And we know this because Sarah Boone isn't bruised. She hasn't got a black eye, a bust lip. She's not got problems with her physical form. He has. He's literally covered in them. Now, these traumas and contusions, they're consistent with a possible baseball bat strike, but they're not definitively caused by that. And they're also not definitively why he died. They weren't lethal on their own. They wouldn't have killed him, but they obviously injured him. And again, when we think about what Brian Boone has said about his ex-wife, Sarah Boone, he says she is physically very abusive. And somebody willing to take a bat to you, that's a terrifying level of violence. They also did George's blood alcohol content, and they found that it was, as expected, above the driving legal limit. So it shows that he was impaired in his ability to escape. Sarah's intoxication at the time, that wasn't actually fully documented, but she did actually admit that she drank multiple bottles and glasses of wine. So essentially, they know that she was also inebriated. Now, she is so shocked when she is charged with second-degree murder. Now, under Florida law, first-degree murder typically requires premeditation. Second-degree murder, on the other hand, it can involve a depraved mind, but it doesn't necessarily require that premeditation. Prosecutors, they evidently and firmly believed that even if Boone did not actually plan in advance to kill Torres, it was clear that her actions just went beyond negligence into what they described as a territory of extreme disregard for human life. Now, the seriousness of that evidence led to Boone being in custody. They didn't allow her any freedom. They didn't agree bond. Efforts to secure bail or bond were actually denied, or they were set at a really prohibitively high amount. So essentially, they didn't want her walking the streets. Now, the details of her bond hearings have not been extensively reported, but the public case information that I found just said that she remained in jail as the legal proceedings continued. Now, what can we say about her from this point on? Well, first of all, during those first few court appearances, I'd say Boone's demeanour seemed subdued, but she certainly didn't seem overtly distraught. And those who observed her said that it was really notable that she just carried on sticking to this narrative that this was just a tragic accident, even as the prosecution are basically saying, listen, we've got videos, we've got this incriminating video that proves that what you're saying about being a tragic accident is just not true. Now, before the case reached a final trial, what can we say about Sarah Boone's behaviour? Well, she had a little bit of a penchant for running through attorneys. She literally changed attorneys multiple times. So initially she's got a public defender, but then she gets rid of that person, seeks private counsel. That private counsel withdrew. And we all know that when a private counsel withdraws, it's because they've got good reason. They don't think that they can represent their client effectively. The client won't agree to terms that they feel is important for protecting that client, and so on and so forth. Now, a second and a third round of representation followed, Every single time a new attorney comes on board, they end up requiring additional time because they need to review discovery, including extensive forensic evidence, cell phone data, police reports, witness statements. So this means that you're having these repeated postponements of the trial date. And that means that she's obviously inside for longer. She's protesting that she's actually guilty, but she's actually meaning that her sentence is ongoing because she's not been tried at this moment. So freedom is far away for her because of her own actions. Now, during the pre-trial hearings, the presiding judge, what can we say, expressed a little bit of frustration about the delays, but also with respect to that judge, they recognised that Boone had constitutional rights, and one of those constitutional rights included her right to counsel of her choice. Now, Boone appeared alternately anxious and dissatisfied during some of those status conferences. Repeatedly, she would just insist on a defence strategy that would go ahead and reflect her claim that it was all a tragic alcohol-fuelled accident. Now, with that in mind, the idea that she wants to go with her story, if you are a dyed-in-the-wool defender, and you have been defending clients for a long period of time, you know what? The difference between you and your client is you know what the likely outcomes are. And you have a vested interest in either winning or at least doing the best for your clients so they don't spend the rest of their days in prison, for example. The last thing that you need in those circumstances is someone with that Ted Bundy mindset. It's fine. I'll do it all myself. I can represent myself. You know nothing, I'm a brilliant legal mind, I'm just not qualified. And we all know how Ted Bundy ended up 1984 in the electric chair. Didn't work for him either, and at least he did have some qualifications in law, albeit he failed in the long term with that law degree. What I'm saying is, the last thing you need as a defender is somebody who is actually in prison because of their failures in life, telling you that you know less than they do about how you should play the case. So when she's sitting with them, she's obviously like, I want to go with the tragic accident. It was a tragic accident. Okay, could you just explain to me why you think that's a good defence? I think it's a good defence because then they won't find me guilty of second-degree murder because it's an accident. Yes, I know, but they could find you guilty of second-degree murder based on the fact that they think they've got really good, solid evidence as to why you could be seen as very much guilty of second-degree murder. I don't think I was, though, because what I'm saying is it was a tragic accident. And it's very clear to me that it was a tragic accident because I was the person in there who created the tragic accident. If I was present, I was the person, therefore, most likely to be able to describe exactly what happened because the other person in the situation is dead. So I am the only witness to that situation, and I'm saying it was a tragic accident. So you need to convince the world that it's a tragic accident. Yes, Sarah, I would have liked to have done that for you, but I think you're forgetting the highly incriminating videos where it's clear it's not a tragic accident, and also the autopsy, which suggests that you literally injured him with a bat before he died. So I'm wondering how that's a tragic accident, because I'm saying that I'm a domestic abuse survivor and his death that I caused will now be used as a lesson so that I can educate other people on how to deal with their own domestic abuse. So it's a tragic accident. Where are we going? Just putting my files away and I'm just going to withdraw and go on a long holiday. There must be nothing more challenging for a defender who has to come across a client like this, knowing that actually she is essentially burying herself. She's literally piling the soil over her own head by not listening to what they're saying. Now, a really notable thing happens during this case. Sarah Boone is offered a 15-year plea deal. This is prior to her trial. So if she pleads guilty to manslaughter, she can acknowledge that, yes, 15 years is a long time. Look, no one in the right mind is going to pretend for a second that 15 years is a short amount of time to give up of your life. But a man died. She certainly caused his death. And essentially, she has to pay the consequences of that. It speaks again of her lack of accountability, her lack of responsibility, also her lack of care for Jorge Torres, that when she is given an opportunity to literally serve 15 years, knowing that she will spend most of her life free, she refuses it. She said, I'm not going to plead guilty to manslaughter. And the defense lawyer is like, what? And she's like, I'm not doing it. It's a tragic accident. Sarah, take the plea deal because this assures you of the vast majority of the rest of your life walking freely, seeing your child, being involved in your friends' lives, your family's life. Take the deal. And she says, no. Now, again, that shows that she is completely unaware of how the legal system works. Also, what that means in court, because she could get a far lengthier sentence, and what that means for her child, who will probably have to visit his mother, if he chooses to, for many, many decades if she refuses to go ahead with this plea deal and instead chances that child. And it is a chance. And bear in mind, I don't think any of you need to be called to be a jury member to think about what you would say and what you would do when you've heard the recordings of Jorge Torres pleading for his life, with her resentment frothing over and her desire to harm him further because of the injuries that he received on his body. That's not an accident. Nobody accidentally hits you with a bat. Nobody accidentally turns the case over so that you can't get out. Nobody accidentally ignores your pleas for help when you are literally suffocating. But no, she insists that she had acted in self-defense, or at least didn't intentionally murder George. So again, where's the self-defense? At the end of the day, I do appreciate that even a slight man can be more physically powerful than a bigger woman. It's just the way biology works. It's just one of those unfortunate things. Women are in more danger from men. Fortunately, not most men, but nonetheless, we are. But you cannot use that argument when the guy you're apparently afraid of is zipped in a suitcase and can't get out. If men who are violent were just zipped in suitcases and couldn't get out, women wouldn't have to deal with violence because they're in suitcases. So self-defense doesn't work. And even though I appreciate that she is saying she didn't intentionally murder George, and I actually believe that, guys, I wholeheartedly can say that in this moment to you. Some of you will disagree with me entirely, and you have a right to do that. I am telling you now, I've looked at this case, I've analysed this case, I've researched this case, I've watched every single interview there is with her out there, I've watched the court's conversations and communication, I've looked at all the filings. This woman does not believe she murdered him, and she doesn't believe she murdered him because she didn't intend to. I fully accept that. But he died. And he died in a torturous way after being brutalised to some degree by her. If you're on the jury, who are you listening to? Are you listening to the medical examiners, the autopsy that's brought in as far as the report is concerned, the officers who turned up and saw her, the phone data and information, the way she's acted during this case, pushing it back, because she's not happy with the way things are playing out? Or are you going to believe that actually she's not really a bad person who left him, went to bed, and essentially caused his death? She's putting herself in an entirely precarious situation. And again, it reeks of that self-interest. It reeks of that arrogance. It reeks of that superiority. It suggests that she, personality-wise, just cannot acknowledge that somebody died in this situation. And somehow she's pivoted the whole belief system to say, I am the victim. I am the individual that people should feel sorry for. And of course, that is going to wholly go across against the grain when it comes down to people's perception of her. And bear in mind, this woman, during this is all playing out, is writing 58-page letters to the judge, totally deriding them on a personal and professional level. So she is going in for every individual that she feels is not listening to her, is not giving her enough time, is not seeing that she is the person that people need to be thinking of because it's her who's the victim. It is ludicrous to see how psychologically she hasn't just distanced herself from her actions, she's distanced herself from reality, so far away from it indeed, that she's created this whole new sub-reality where the world is against her and she is fighting for her freedom, even when she doesn't see that the reason that she has no freedom is because she is a criminal and she's responsible for somebody's death.
It was just strange that he was small enough to fit in there, and then I kind of moved it around a little bit with him in the suitcase still. It was still funny that he was still in the suitcase. Just, I think he and I were just kind of couldn't believe that he could fit in the suitcase.
Now, of course, one of the things about Sarah Boone is she's very unusual. And so The whole world sets on fire really with this case. It garners local, national, international attention. A lot of that's to do with that chilling phone footage, of course. And many of the jurors actually said that they'd already heard about the suitcase murder. And that meant that when they were trying to do jury selection, it was actually really difficult to make an impartial jury selection. Having said that, the very fact that they're saying, oh yeah, probably don't select me because I've heard about the suitcase murder, and probably listen to the footage, it doesn't deny that the footage is there, and they're going to hear that in court anyway. And I appreciate that what they're trying to do there is reduce bias, but the minute you hear those recordings, the bias is going to be there. But essentially, they want to focus on impartiality. It ends up that the lawyers, when they're trying to create the jury selection, are asking probing questions about prospective jurors, the attitudes they have about domestic violence, about alcohol abuse, and also about the significance of digital video evidence, because they want to give her as fair a trial as possible. Now, Sarah Boone's case was just constantly riddled with repeated continuances. The defence counsel cited complexities involving mental health, about the evaluations that they needed to get sorted for her, the forensic examination, the large amounts of digital evidence, because of course she's repeatedly getting rid of attorneys, or they're asking to be rid of her. So that discovery is just carrying on and on and on. And to add to all of those stoppages that are occurring because of her behaviour, then there's a Hurricane Milton that occurs, so that gets in the way as well. Now, the prosecutors, they also struggle with scheduling hurdles because there were key witnesses that they wanted, and they needed to bring in people like law enforcement officers who've been at the scene, medical experts. They wanted to make sure that they had a slam dunk case. So, even though this case happens all the way back in the COVID crisis in 2020, here we are in 2024 on the 14th of October when the trial finally goes to court. Now, just put this into your minds, guys. She was offered a plea deal of 15 years. By this point, Sarah Boone has already served 4 years, 9 months and 8 days. Essentially, she's nearly a third through that plea deal offer. The plea deal offer that she has rejected, and with respect, the plea deal offer that I'm sure she will regret rejecting in the long term. Now, the defence's case, they don't have a lot of wriggle room really, because they've got their client saying exactly what she expects. So they are citing their main defense as self-defense and domestic violence. The defense counsel, who I do not envy whatsoever, a guy called James Owens, he presented a pattern of alleged abuse that had been inflicted by George on Sarah Boone. So there were photos of her blackened eyes, her bruised arms. There were text messages in which Sarah indicated fear for her own safety, and they're real. So I am not going to pretend for 1 minute, like I said at the very beginning of this, that there are not nuances to this case. I believe that Sarah Boone was a victim. She was also a perpetrator, but we're not going to deny that woman's experience. She was blackened with her eyes. She was bruised. There were threats. Evidently, Jorge Torres was violent towards her, and violent in a very, very horrific way. Now, the defense at this point, they say what Sarah was trying to do was to protect herself. She was referencing the choking incidents on that recording, which clearly is reference to something she'd experienced. So again, we are going to see her as a victim in those incidents, but we have to separate those incidents from what's playing out here. And I appreciate that some of you will be saying, well, no, Emma, battered woman syndrome. Now that exists. In fact, I suppose we would more know it as battered person syndrome, because men have also been in a situation where they've endured horrific violence at the hands of a partner and have actually killed that partner. And understandably, that is taken into consideration when putting them through the courts, or even deciding whether they should be put through the courts because of their history. So, she certainly will be somebody who could have, in certain circumstances, potentially with that evidence, have relied on battered syndrome. But the truth is, that's when somebody feels there's no other option but to kill the individual. They believe that that individual will never leave them alone, and that the only way they can free themselves, albeit if that freedom means that they spend the rest of their life in prison, is to kill them. Jorge Torres was in a suitcase. She literally could have left the house. Jorge Torres was being recorded when she resentfully and angrily voiced her feelings towards him about their history. Jorge Torres was begging for his life and she chose not to offer it him. So it's going to be really hard to suggest it's battered woman syndrome. The defence also bring in photographs of Sarah with bruises and injuries from earlier fights. And again, they are bolstering the claims that she felt threatened, and rightly so. Now, that lawyer contended that the couple had had a history of playful pranks and that an intoxicated Boone genuinely believed Torres could free himself. And again, just going to come down on the side of logic, I think that that's true. I genuinely think that Sarah Boone believed that he would get himself out. Maybe she believed that he would spend the night in there. I don't think she believed for a second he was going to die. So the defence basically urged the jurors to consider the context, so the couple's level of intoxication, Boone's clear mental state, she'd got anxiety and depression, and that actually prevented her from grasping the severity of the situation. I think that's a really loose connector, by the way. Listen, people have anxiety and depression day in, day out, and actually when you're hyper anxious, you tend to act in an oversensitive manner, not an undersensitive manner. In fact, if you were anxious that your partner might be in distress, the likelihood is you would have got them out or not even allowed them to get in the suitcase because it would have pricked your anxiety. So that doesn't really work very effectively in that defence mechanism. Now, whilst the defence claimed that it wasn't an insanity defence they were going for, they did aim to show that Sarah Boone lacked the malicious intent typical of murder. Again, I think that's a fair argument. They got a substance abuse specialist who came in and spoke about the role of heavy alcohol consumption, how that really impairs your judgment, and how that suggested that she was likely impaired from making rational decisions, that she was severely compromised when it came down to making those decisions. But again, people get in cars drunk and they kill kids. You don't say, oh, you know what, we've got to feel a bit sorry for them because after they had that half bottle of gin, they got in a car and killed a child. We say, you need to go to prison. You were under the influence of alcohol, driving a vehicle, you caused a death. And no one has a problem saying that. So the idea that you can excuse your behaviour because you're drunk is just not going to wash with anybody. We've all been drunk. We don't get involved in murders or killings or even hurting people that we love on the whole. So that's a flawed argument. So their defence is basically saying this is about intoxication and accidental death. They say that she was too impaired to recognise that George was in real danger. They point out the high alcohol blood levels in both parties and say this clouded judgment on both parts. They also attack the second-degree murder charge, saying it's too extreme. This was a tragic mishap, or at worst, they say, it was manslaughter. Now, Sarah Boone takes the stand. And she actually wept on the stand. She claimed that she never meant to cause harm to him. She said, when he got in there, we were playing. I've never been so drunk and so hurt before. I went to bed, I didn't hear him. She also talked about her words in the videos, particularly with the, that's what you do when you choke me. And she said, all I was doing then, I was just venting frustration over the months or years of physical abuse from him. So she's trying to explain the reasoning behind that video. Now, the prosecution are feeling no empathy and no sympathy for her. Prosecutor Dave Cacciatore Jr., he dramatically revealed the actual suitcase in the courtroom. So he drags this in. And that makes it very real for the jury. It really is. I've talked about a case where they actually brought in a mattress where somebody was murdered. And essentially that brings what happened into the actual room. They are present with the item that was involved in the final moments of the individual whose case is being heard's murder or death. And it's very emotive. So he just goes for this really grim tone. He describes how Jorge Torres' final minutes were recorded, how he begged for his life whilst he's confined to this tiny suitcase, of course, pointing to the suitcase at the time. He said that confinement led to the gradual, slow suffocation of Jorge Torres.
Can we see how it was that the two zipper parts were positioned when you say that Mr. Torres was able to get his hand out? If you want me to do it, I'm fine to take your direction.
From what I remember, this is how the suitcase works. This piece up here. This was not as hard either. So this one, like here.
Okay.
Right.
About right there, ma'am?
Sure.
I assume this one was much closer? It's not over there? Or did you leave?
You asked me where I zipped it.
When you say that was zipped shut, show us.
Are you talking about how I zipped it, or?
When you're done zipping it shut, he's inside of it, where are the zipper components? Just tell me where it's at up.
I mean, it was the corner. I mean, it's not.
He brought in the medical evidence that highlighted just how slow and agonising his death would have been. Then another prosecutor, William J., he actually later said, listen, Sarah Boone wanted to terrorise Jorge Torres. And basically this was referring the way that she beat him with a baseball bat, also the way she mocked him, the way she ignored his pleas. And this was really damning evidence against her. Also, the first responders gave evidence. They said that Sarah Boone was manic at first, but then she was really oddly calm when she was giving statements. It felt very unusual, bearing in mind the enormity of what had happened. And that again adds to this idea that there was something rather fractured in Sarah Boone's psyche and also actions. Now, of course, the key evidence, well, the suitcase itself, that was brought into court. This is basically peddled as the prison in which Jorge Torres died. Massively emotive evidence. They had the videos, literally the anchor of the state's case. That shows that Sarah Boone is literally mocking Jorge Torres. Her attitudes are awful. So the prosecution just feel that it's easy for them to argue that if she hadn't originally planned to kill him, which she obviously didn't, her depraved indifference was, as far as they were concerned, enough to prove second-degree murder. Now, jurors were apparently really unsettled by the footage. Apparently, several of them seemed very, very distressed as they hear Jorge Torres pleading for his life. Just bear in mind, they're hearing somebody who's no longer present. They're hearing his life ebbing away. He's dead, and they are literally hearing his last moments play out in court. The timestamp footage, that's also damning. Bear in mind, she says that she passed out, that she never heard a word from him after, but her videos were actually recorded late into the night. Then they introduced the autopsy photos. They show bruises that were consistent with blunt force trauma. They show crime scene pictures of the battered suitcase in the living room. And this prosecutor just keeps emphasising that even if Sarah Boone's initial act was intended as a joke, her decision to leave him trapped demonstrates a depraved mind. Bear in mind, that meets the bar for second-degree murder, a depraved mind. So essentially, under Florida law, he's really pushing the fact that it's evident that only somebody with a depraved mind would have carried out what you are hearing and seeing in this courtroom today. Also, they bring in quite a lot of witness testimonies. So they bring in neighbours who recount hearing arguments that escalate dramatically in the weeks prior to the incident. They talk about really loud arguments, physical disputes, heavy drinking. Now, Boone's defence team, they were using this as an explanation as to why her behaviour escalated into cruelty that night. Now, a forensic pathologist was brought in, and that forensic pathologist explained that Jorge Torres would have felt absolute sheer panic because he would have very quickly started to understand that oxygen was being deprived. He'd be going through that oxygen depletion physically, and that would mean that literally when he was calling out, if you were in a house with him and he was sober, you'd never have been able to overlook that. So clearly as well, we're talking about the contribution of alcohol, but not the excuse that it can be used that somehow that makes you innocent because you were so drunk you didn't acknowledge the inhumane treatment that was playing out. When it came down to the closing arguments, the prosecution's summation was strong. Dave Cacciatore Jr. once again takes the suitcase out for the jury to see. He basically labelled Sarah's alleged fear of George a convenient deflection. He pointed out how she was the one outside the suitcase, she was the one in control, she was the one who was ignoring his repeated cries for help. Prosecutor William J., he stressed, listen, she terrorised him. She had the power to unzip that suitcase at any moment, but she didn't. The defence's last appeal, they just again highlight those photos of Sarah's bruises, and they repeated she was not the abuser in the relationship, he was. They then insisted that if she truly intended to murder him, she would not have recorded the events. Instead, they said it was a foolish, drunken attempt to document an argument. Again, I don't think the defense did a really bad job at all. I think they're just fighting a real uphill battle here. When it came down to the verdict, that happened on October the 25th, 2024, and she was indeed found guilty of second-degree murder. This is after 10 days of testimony, and with respect, the jury took just 90 minutes of deliberation. At this point, they all agree she is guilty. So they found that whilst it might not have been premeditated plan, that would have been obviously first-degree murder, the evidence, as far as they were concerned, did show a depraved indifference that was sufficient for second-degree murder under Florida law. When it came down to Sarah Boone's reaction, the witnesses who watched her in the courtroom said that she closed her eyes, she bowed her head as the verdict was read, and she was described at some points as trembling. Eventually, she placed her head in her hands. Some family members of Jorge Torres wept. They were holding one another. It was a really emotional scene. Now, when you consider the trial and the evidence that was entered, you can see that Boone and Torres' relationship was absolutely one that had been marked by turbulence. We're not going to deny that. Sarah and Jorge Torres' union, it embodied so many classic hallmarks of domestic turmoil, repeated separations, dramatic reconciliations, deep-seated resentment, the addiction to alcohol potentially. They had loved ones on both sides who suspected that something was wrong, but the couple just remained secretive. Sometimes they'd cover their bruises with makeup, they'd deflect the injuries as accidents. Also, we can add to that, we know at the time when he died, there were financial, emotional and psychological stresses. We know that Sarah claimed that she bore the brunt of the couple's financial strain, while George's unstable employment added lots of friction to their lives. And they were also struggling to pay rent on time. It caused them to fight about potential eviction. In texts received by law enforcement, Sarah complained about being stuck in a toxic dynamic, yet she also threatened to sabotage George's relationships with his family if he left her, so absolutely toxic beyond belief. We also know that alcohol in this case was a catalysing force. One detective who testified at the trial noted that literally the household was just littered with empty bottles and cans. That's emblematic of their clear, heavy drinking pattern. Now, experts in domestic violence warn that intoxication does not excuse lethal behaviour, rather it strips away the caution or empathy that might otherwise prevent a tragedy. So essentially, the prosecution had the phone as that smoking gun. Because in many homicide cases, the thing about the motive, the thing about the timeline can be elusive. Yet the thing about the present day is that digital evidence can tell a horrifying story. And it did. That horrifying story contradicted Sarah's initial statements. Also, they found other video snippets weeks prior. This is where they were recording arguments. Now, that was not as incriminating, but again, it just indicated that Sarah had this pattern of hostility and petty vengeance. Now, again, some of you might be surprised that she was charged and found guilty of second-degree murder. As I said, in Florida, first-degree murder generally requires premeditation. Prosecutors never went to allege that Sarah planned the killing. In fact, instead, they argued that she committed an act so imminently dangerous that it exhibited a depraved mind. That's all they needed to prove. And I think we can all agree that's absolutely how it came across. The repeated mocking of George's pleas, the alleged baseball bat strike, all of this absolutely supports an inference that Sarah's actions went well beyond an accident. And as I've said, I don't think the defence did a bad job, because the mention of self-defence, it does hold weight in some domestic violence contexts. However, the problem is, once Jorge Torres was zipped up, once he was physically helpless, the rationale for fear or self-protection diminishes. And the cruelty in ignoring those final pleas on video, that just formed a mountain of evidence that the defence simply couldn't overcome. When it came down to the sentencing hearing that happened on the 3rd of December 2024, and of course there were real emotional impact statements read out. So several of Jorge Torres' family members spoke before sentencing. His sister Victoria Torres, she actually addressed Sarah directly. "You deserve to rot in jail for what you did. My brother cried out for you to help him. You left him to die. You've caused a lifetime of pain for our family." Another relative described the devastation of Jorge Torres' children, his nieces, his nephews, who all apparently adored him. The defence, well, they plea for leniency. Bearing in mind there was a 15-year plea deal on the table, they're hoping that this is something that's potentially going to be reflected in the sentence. James Owens argues that Sarah Boone is an abuse victim. She lost control. She was in a drunken haze. He said, please consider a lack of previous felony convictions. He also said Sarah has already served 58 months, nearly 5 years in detention awaiting trial. Now, before the judge pronounced the sentence, Sarah Boone actually made a statement. And she said, I fell in love with a monster. I tried to break away, but never stopped loving him. I didn't mean for this to happen. Forgive me, George. Forgive me, Torres family. It's very different to take responsibility and accountability on one hand and then slate the victim on the other. To do that in court seems, again, to be an own goal. To actually stand there and to call the man who suffocated slowly in the most hideous scenario whilst begging for his life as the monster, when the actions that led to his death were monstrous and you were the person who inflicted them on him, the paradox there, the juxtaposition just feels so unholy. And again, it speaks of Sarah Boone's inability to see herself as an individual responsible for somebody's death. She sees herself still as the victim.
My statement, my verbal statement, is primarily to the Torres family, to the judge, to his daughters. I know you all know who I really am, and that I did care for George, and that I do still love George. I know you know that we had very many good days, and I take offense to the statement of being said that this is just for a moment. Right now with me here in the courtroom in front of you all, this is just for a moment. But the moments before that, in order for me to be here, is endless. It's everlasting. The scars that I have on the inside, my outside scars have healed except for my stab wound. But this has changed me as a person to see things differently and to understand things differently and to not be weak and just try to protect yourself, and forever, regardless of the time that I may receive from today, I forever will have this experience. I forever will have Jorge Torres with me in my heart, in my mind, my body, and my soul. As he and I used to say that we were one soul split into two bodies. This is not just for a moment. It may be for everyone in this courtroom, but when I leave, this is forever. When you all leave, that this is forever. This is forever for everyone here and those who it matters to most. I am one of those who will experience this forever. I'm sorry. Words do not define my shame, and I don't know what else it is that I can say and convey to the Torres family how this happened. The ifs and whys and how really don't matter. It happened, and I'm sorry. Words cannot describe. And I hope that everyone can forgive me, the Torres family most of all, and his daughters.
You can't say to the Torres family, I am sorry. I'm sorry that you lost a father, a nephew, a brother, a son. I'm sorry. And at the same time, tell them the reason he's dead is because he was a monster. It absolutely contradicts the sentiments completely. Also, she went on, as ever, because Sarah Boone is never wrong, to criticise the trial's media coverage. She claimed that her explanations were taken out of context. They weren't. They were her explanations. They were the context. But at this point, in spite of blaming everybody else, she then says, could you please forgive me? I know I've caused heartbreak. So again, every statement criticises another individual's responsibility that she sees played into her being found guilty. every statement blames somebody else for the situation without her acknowledging her role to play in it. And even though she tries to say, I accept that he's dead, she frames it in the guise of him being the reason why he's dead. Now, when it came down to the sentencing, Circuit Judge Michael Kranick, he actually went ahead and he imposed a life sentence without the possibility of parole for second-degree murder. So he referenced the depraved mind aspect of Florida law. He said, this court has seen all manner of tragedy, but few acts exhibit such a callous disregard for human life as leaving a partner to suffocate and filming his cries for help. Justice mandates life in prison. Sarah's refusal of that 15-year manslaughter deal stands as a critical juncture. And legal analysts have actually speculated that Sarah's belief in her innocence or her story of never intending to kill him caused her to essentially gamble on acquittal or indeed a lesser charge. Now that gamble has ended with a life sentence, which is an outcome far more severe than the plea would have guaranteed. Now I don't know how you guys feel about that sentencing. Obviously it caused international interest because of the shocking nature of the killing, also the sentencing, because obviously it's a forever sentence in prison. And certainly some people believe that that is absolutely what should have happened, and others feel differently. Like Victoria Torres and all the other relatives, they said that they were relieved at the outcome. They say that no sentence could have brought Jorge Torres back, but at least she's been given a very severe one. They also said that they hoped that this case would highlight the dangers of domestic violence and it would be taken seriously no matter who claims to be the aggressor. They also hope that people understand just how substance abuse can fuel these tragic outcomes. As I've said, they were not sympathetic to Sarah Boone at all. They feel that he was left to die in a torturous situation, and they kept noting that he was a really incredible father. So since that sentencing, women's shelters and advocacy groups have pointed out the complexities of domestic violence. The truth is, they say abusers can be male and can be female, and that relationships can have this mutual toxicity, and that the suitcase murders just demonstrates that. Sarah Boone is now in prison. She began her incarceration at Orange County Jail, and this is a life sentence without parole. She has since been transferred to a Florida Department of Corrections facility for life. She made an appeal on December the 18th, 2024, but legal experts believe the video evidence and the robust prosecution means that it's going to be very unlikely that her appeal will succeed. And since her trial, you know, all those letters she kept writing to the lawyers, to the judges, yeah, she's not calmed down, guys. She's not thought, oh, maybe I just need to be quiet for a while because at the end of the day, things haven't worked well when I'm doing things my way. No, she was like, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to send a 28-page scathing letter to Judge Michael Kranick. I'm going to tell him that he's ignorant. I'm going to tell him that I need a lesser sentence. I'm going to say, listen, you had your mind made up. It wasn't a fair or neutral trial. She said that he is somebody who is essentially corrupt. She wanted to appeal the sentence purely because she wouldn't have to be, quote, in his corrupt court. In another letter, because she's not stopping, she claimed that prison has been one of the greatest experiences of my life. If I were not beaten to death, I was going to work myself to death on the outside. And I never got time to get back into my Bible and pray to be with the Lord. Being incarcerated, I've had time to get closer to God, to reacquaint myself with him. Okay, Sarah, that makes absolute sense. You weren't actually working very often outside of prison, and I'm not really sure that it was one of the big GOD's plans for Jorge Torres to die in a horrible way where he's basically executed in a suitcase so that you could get to your Bible study. But hey, like I said, this woman is as narcissistic as they come. Now, the trial and sentencing has concluded. She is now going to spend the rest of her life in prison. She has exercised her right to appeal. Like I said, it's very unlikely it's going to actually work in her favour. The truth is, even though she has only been in prison for a few months, the fact that she is writing to the judge again highlights that self-importance, the indignation, which will have little impact on the case itself, but obviously makes her feel better. And let's be clear, Sarah Boone is going to have plenty of time to become reacquainted with the Lord whilst literally serving the rest of her life in prison. And before I go on this case, I just want to say my thoughts. Did Sarah Boone kill Jorge Torres? Absolutely. Does she deserve a long long sentence in prison for his killing? Absolutely. Did she make some grievous decisions that led to his death? Absolutely. Was she violent towards him? Absolutely. Is she an absolutely insufferable kind of human being? Absolutely. Do I believe she should go to prison for the rest of her natural life? No. And that is probably going to cause some of you to be surprised. But I genuinely do not believe that Sarah Boone would pose an immediate risk to our society if after 20 years she was released. I do believe that that plea deal initially was a fair plea deal. It's serious enough to say that she's going to lose 15 years of her life, but it also actually acknowledges that she was a victim in some part too. That does not excuse what she did. I am completely on board with the fact that she's deserving of a very lengthy sentence, but I do know that I've covered many cases in America where individuals have done worse than Sarah Boone and they are not serving the natural life in prison. Do I believe the press coverage, do I believe the emotions involved in this case have added and contributed to that sentence? 100%. Do I believe that Sarah Boone's actions as an insufferable type of human being who constantly derides judges and lawyers has contributed to this sentence? Absolutely. The truth is that she has created her own destruction. But it does leave me feeling a little bit unsettled that she will spend the rest of her life in prison, because you have to weigh up whether that person could contribute to society again, whether that person could be licensed to actually be in the public and be actually covered by probation, made sure that she sticks to the objectives within her agreements so that she's safe in the community, and that could in the end cost the taxpayer lower and also mean that she repents to some degree on her actions and has another shot at freedom maybe 30 years down the road. Not everybody will agree with me. I'm just saying that I feel, weighting what I've seen about other reactions to cases by judges, that this sentencing involved more than just the actual necessity of those years and came down more to him not particularly liking Sarah Boone and feeling that she needed to be held to account in a very public way. I'd love to know if you disagree with me. You probably do, it's fine. Like I said, I'm just coming from a place where I do not necessarily see her as the hideous individual fully that she's been portrayed as. She's a terrible human being, but like I said, one that potentially could have been salvageable at some point 20 years down the line. I also hope that her son is living his best life. Clearly the one saving grace that we've got about this boy, even though he's a teenager when all this played out, is that he has a great dad. And that will hopefully act as the buffer from the horror that he's had to endure, where his mother name has become an international sensation. Let me know your thoughts in the comments. I hope I've told you more about this case than you might have known. And if you know any more, as ever, leave me a comment, because it really, really, really intrigues me when you get information that I didn't have. See you again next time, guys. Be safe.